Panetta argues that President Obama is making up for lost time and going after ISIS now because of the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011.
Would ISIS be as much of a threat today had we left some force behind?
I do think that if we had had a presence there, it might not have created the kind of vacuum that we saw develop in Iraq.
He blames former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and a passive White House.
You describe a White House that, and this is your word, that frustrated you, that didn't use the leverage, and that is your word too, leverage, that we had in the United States to try and keep a force in Iraq.
Okay, what I'm saying is that Maliki was the kind of leader that you had to constantly put pressure on to direct him in the right direction. We had, with Iraq, made a commitment with regards to military assistance, F-16 fighter planes, other types of military aid, that I think if we had said, look, you know, if you're not going to give us the agreement that we need to maintain our force there, you know, we may not provide this kind of assistance. In other words,
a threat.
Try to push him. Of course. I mean, you know, you need to threaten guys like that who won't come along, and everybody knew that.
But you wrote that the president's active advocacy was missing. So are you saying he didn't give it the push?
I think the kind of push and direct involvement that I think could have had an impact simply never developed, because the sense was, if they don't want it, then why should we want it?
Panetta describes a similar scenario on the question of arming the Syrian rebels in 2012. As defense secretary, he made the case to do it, as did most of the national security team. But the president never signed off, arguing the weapons could wind up in the wrong hands.
I mean, it's understandable. But at the same time, if we're going to influence the rebel forces, if we're going to try to establish a moderate element to those forces, that it was important to provide this kind of assistance in order to have some leverage over what they were going to do.
There was honest disagreement, but then no decision.
You know, to a large extent, it wasn't that the president kind of said, no, we shouldn't do it. The president kind of never really came to a decision as to whether or not it should happen.
What do you mean by that, never came to a decision?
I think it basically sat there for a while and then got to the point where everybody just kind of assumed that it was not going to happen.
Is that the right way to do things?
I think it would have been far better had he just made the decision we're not going to do it, and so that everybody kind of knew where we stood. But we all kind of waited to see whether or not he would ultimately come around. And it didn't happen.
And you talk about hesitation and half steps. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, it was that kind of just hesitation to really, you know, do what needed to be done. Now, you know, don't get me wrong. I think he was very strong in terms of the war on terrorism, and he made some tough decisions. But there were these decisions that basically never were confronted that I think in many ways contributed to the problems we're facing today.
Finally, the president is taking action, Panetta says, albeit a bit late.
It didn't happen. He's made the decision to put troops on the ground in Iraq to try to help the security forces. He's made the decision to arm and train rebel forces in Syria, and he's made the decision to conduct air attacks. So in many ways, he's made the right decisions now. I think those decisions should have been made 2 years ago.